Adrien was a man who stood out in any crowd. With his muscular build, broad shoulders, and commanding presence, it was impossible to miss him. He worked for a large construction company, where his physical strength and work ethic quickly made him a respected figure among his colleagues. But beyond his rugged exterior, Adrien was a kind, calm, and loyal man, always ready to lend a helping hand. At work, he had become good friends with Frank, an older man who was as robust as Adrien, but far more outgoing. Frank had a hearty laugh and a magnetic personality that made him the life of any group. The two bonded over shared jokes, life advice, and long conversations during breaks at the construction site. Their friendship was easy and genuine, forged in the heat of their physically demanding work. One afternoon, after wrapping up a particularly exhausting shift, Frank invited Adrien over for a barbecue at his house. "You've got to come, man. I want you to meet my son. He's a good kid. I think you'll get along," Frank said with a grin, wiping the sweat off his brow. Adrien accepted the invitation, and that weekend he met Nathan, Frank's son, a lively, friendly young man who shared his father's open and warm personality. The afternoon was filled with good food, laughter, and light-hearted banter. Adrien enjoyed the warmth of Frank's family, a welcome change from his solitary life. Over time, Frank's invitations to his home became more frequent. On one of these visits, Adrien met Austin, a close friend of Nathan's who seemed to be a regular guest at the house. Austin was a stark contrast to Adrien, slender, with delicate features and a reserved, almost shy demeanor. He had a soft, feminine air about him that made him stand out, though he seemed to prefer staying in the background. Despite their differences, Adrien couldn't help but be intrigued by Austin. The young man was polite and thoughtful, but there was something about the way he avoided direct eye contact and his quiet laughter that stirred a curiosity in Adrien he couldn't quite explain. During these visits, Adrien often found his gaze drifting toward Austin, who always seemed nervous in his presence. One night, Frank invited Adrien to stay over after a late dinner. "No sense in driving home so late, man. Stay here. There's plenty of room," Frank insisted, and Adrien agreed. He made himself comfortable on the couch in the living room, ready for a peaceful night. But in the middle of the night, Adrien woke up. He wasn't sure what had stirred him from his sleep, but he lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of the house. That's when he heard soft footsteps in the hallway. Turning his head toward the noise, he saw a figure moving through the shadows. It was Austin. The dim light of the moon streaming through the windows illuminated more than Austin likely realized. He was wearing an unexpectedly revealing outfit, a cropped tank top that barely reached his midriff and shorts so tight they clung to his every curve. It was clear he thought everyone was sound asleep, including Adrien, who remained perfectly still on the couch, watching silently. Adrien couldn't help but notice every detail, the delicate grace of Austin's movements, the way his hair fell over his face, and how his slim figure looked even more alluring in the faint light. There was something almost hypnotic about the young man's unguarded state as he crossed the living room toward the kitchen, completely unaware of Adrien's watchful eyes. Adrien knew he should close his eyes, pretend he hadn't seen anything, but something kept him frozen in place. There was a strange mix of fascination and desire that held him captive, his gaze following Austin's every step as though he were caught in a spell. A few minutes later, Austin returned with a glass of water, retracing his steps back toward his room. He paused briefly, glancing toward the couch, as if to confirm Adrien was still asleep. Satisfied, he continued down the hallway and disappeared into his room. When Austin was out of sight, Adrien let out a deep breath, realizing he had been holding it the entire time. He ran a hand over his face, trying to shake the images that his mind stubbornly clung to. That night, as Adrien drifted back to sleep, one thought lingered in his mind. There was something about Austin that made him want to know him more, much more. The next morning, Adrien awake on the couch. The house was still quiet, the kind of calm that comes with the early hours. He stretched his muscular frame, running a hand over his face to shake off the last remnants of sleep. But as he sat up, his mind drifted to Austin, images of the night before resurfacing, unbidden and vivid. Curiosity tugged at him, and before he knew it, he was on his feet, quietly making his way down the hallway. He knew which room was Austin's, having noticed him disappear there the night before. His steps were careful, the wooden floor creaking faintly beneath his weight. The door to Austin's room was ajar, and Adrien hesitated for a moment, hand resting lightly on the door frame. Peering inside, he saw Austin lying on the bed, curled slightly under a thin blanket. The soft rise and fall of his chest indicated he was still deeply asleep, completely unaware of Adrien's presence. The blanket had shifted during the night, revealing more than it concealed. Austin's cropped tank top had ridden up, exposing his smooth stomach and the curve of his waist. The shorts he wore were equally revealing, clinging to his form in a way that left little to the imagination. Adrien's eyes lingered, tracing the delicate lines of Austin's body. Adrien felt a pang of guilt for watching, but he couldn't look away. There was something magnetic about Austin's peaceful vulnerability, the way he seemed so unguarded in his sleep. It stirred something deep within Adrien, an ache he couldn't quite name, a pull that felt both exhilarating and dangerous. His pulse quickened, his breaths shallow as he stood there, torn between retreating back to the living room and staying rooted to the spot. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to look away, but his thoughts were already racing. Austin's presence had awoken something in him, something he wasn't sure he could ignore. Adrien finally stepped back, leaving the doorway as quietly as he had come. He returned to the living room, his mind buzzing with a mix of emotions, attraction, confusion, and the undeniable urge to get closer to Austin. Sitting back on the couch, he stared out the window, trying to calm his restless thoughts. The aroma of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee began to fill the house. Adrien was focused. He wanted to do something thoughtful for the family, especially Austin, after the unexpected feelings he had experienced earlier. On the counter, he laid out the basics for Frank and Nathan, a hearty plate of scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, and hash browns. But for Austin, Adrien decided to go the extra mile. He had noticed some fresh fruit in the fridge and decided to prepare something lighter, yet more elaborate. He sliced strawberries, bananas, and kiwis with precision, arranging them artfully in a bowl alongside a dollop of whipped cream. He added a small drizzle of honey and a sprinkling of granola on top, creating a colorful and inviting dish. He also toasted a croissant to golden perfection and poured a glass of orange juice. By the time Frank and Nathan emerged from their rooms, stretching and yawning, the dining table was set. "Morning, Adrien," Frank said with a grin. "Smells like heaven in here." "Morning," Adrien replied, giving him a nod. "Thought I'd whip something up for you all. It's nothing fancy, but it'll do." Nathan plopped into a chair, rubbing his eyes. "Man, you're spoiling us, Adrien." As they began to eat, Adrien glanced toward the hallway, waiting for Austin to appear. A few minutes later, Austin shuffled into the kitchen, still looking a little sleepy, but undeniably radiant. He wore a loose sweater that hung slightly off one shoulder and a pair of casual shorts. His hair was slightly tousled, and his cheeks carried the faint flush of someone who had just woken up. "Morning," Austin said softly, his voice still groggy as he looked at Adrien. "Morning," Adrien replied, his tone gentler than usual. "I made breakfast. Yours is a little different. I thought you might like something lighter." Austin's eyes widened slightly as he saw the plate Adrien had prepared for him. The carefully arranged fruit, the golden croissant, and the attention to detail didn't go unnoticed. "Oh, wow, this looks amazing. You didn't have to do that." Adrien shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's no trouble. Figured you'd appreciate it." Austin sat down, taking a tentative bite of the fruit bowl. His face lit up immediately. "This is really good, Adrien." "Thank you." Frank raised an eyebrow, watching the interaction between the two, but said nothing. Nathan was too focused on devouring his own plate to notice the subtle exchange. As they ate, Adrien found himself stealing glances at Austin, who seemed to savor every bite. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing him enjoy the meal Adrien had made with such care. It was a small gesture, but it felt meaningful, a way of expressing the feelings he couldn't yet put into words. When breakfast was over, Austin lingered at the table, looking at Adrien with a shy smile. "You didn't have to go out of your way for me, but it means a lot, really." Adrien leaned against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest. "I wanted to, that's all." Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that quiet exchange, something unspoken passed between them. Adrien felt it, the pull, the connection, and judging by the way Austin's cheeks flushed slightly, he felt it too. After breakfast, as the rest of the household began to disperse, Adrien found himself watching Austin closely. The young man was gathering his empty plate, his delicate hands carefully stacking it with the others on the counter. There was a softness in the way Austin moved that drew Adrien in, a quiet grace that made it impossible to look away. Adrien's chest tightened. He couldn't deny it anymore. The feelings bubbling inside him, the magnetic pull toward Austin, were becoming too strong to ignore. He needed to talk to him, to say something before he lost the nerve. Clearing his throat, Adrien stepped closer. "Austin," he said, his deep voice low enough to keep Frank and Nathan from overhearing. "Can we talk, privately?" Austin turned, his wide eyes blinking up at Adrien in surprise. "Oh, sure," he said softly, his voice unsure but curious. Adrien gestured toward the backyard, a quiet space where they could speak without interruptions. Austin followed him, the summer morning air warm as they stepped outside. The sound of birds chirping filled the silence as Adrien led him to a shaded spot under a tree. Austin stood there, fidgeting slightly with the hem of his sweater, his cheeks already tinged with pink. What's going on?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Adrien ran a hand through his hair, his strong frame towering over Austin, but his expression unusually vulnerable. He looked down at the young man in front of him, searching for the right words, but nothing felt adequate. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh and decided to be honest. "I can't do this anymore, Austin," Adrien said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I've been trying to hold back, to ignore how I feel, but it's getting impossible." Austin's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. "What do you mean?" he asked, though there was a tremor in his voice, as if he already knew. Adrien stepped closer, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over Austin. "You," he said simply. "I can't stop thinking about you. The way you smile, the way you move, the way you look at me when you think I don't notice. You're in my head, Austin, and I can't pretend anymore." Austin's lips parted in shock, his face now fully flushed. "Adrien, He looked down, his fingers gripping the edge of his sweater tightly. Adrien reached out, his large hand gently tilting Austin's chin upward so their eyes met. "If I've misread this, if you don't feel the same, tell me now, and I'll back off. I swear I will. But if there's even a part of you that feels the same way, I need to know." Austin stared at him, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure Adrien could hear it. His eyes flickered over Adrien's face, searching for any hint of insincerity, but all he found was raw